This is a fictional mindbender. One of the reasons that the Andor series is considered so revolutionary when it comes to the Star Wars franchise is that its stories do not revolve around the Force, the Jedi, or at least up front anyways, the Sith. And while it still builds its stories around the titular character of Andor, who was a protagonist in the Rogue One movie some years ago, and Mon Mothma, who's been around since 1983's Return of the Jedi, it is still about unknown ordinary people reacting to Imperial rule. And its storytelling and writing have been so compelling that honestly many people have taken to the opinion that the famous story of the original trilogy is in fact better without the Jedi. That essentially the Jedi of the prequels were in fact fools with their self-righteous heads stepped so far up their own asses that they got played by a politician and had one of their own turn to the dark side right under their noses that resulted in their near annihilation. Now, I'm not gonna lie, I struggled to keep myself from emotionally overreacting to this trend. Yes, I said it, it is a trend, and there's a reason why I'm calling it a trend. That being said though, despite that struggle, I am able to remove myself enough emotionally to see where it's coming from and to empathize with where this popular trend is coming from. The initial excitement over the return of Star Wars to the big screen and mainstream media since the Disney purchase and Force Awakens has dropped significantly in the last decade, and everyone knows this. This is not news. Ever since The Last Jedi, the franchise has increasingly become a cesspool of a toxic online war that has been waged by fans, between the fans and Disney and or the actors, calling them racist or homophobic or whatever if they didn't like the movies, between the actual racist and misogynist fans who really were that prejudiced, and even between Star Wars YouTubers who comment on the franchise. And then on top of all of that, the quality of the product has been very hit and miss, instead of the gold rush of cash that Disney was expecting. The one area of consistent success has been the animation shows, and that's a credit to them. But the sequel trilogy is at best divisive between those who love them, those that despise them, and those who at this point quite frankly don't even care. The Mandalorian, which I said in an earlier video, had saved the Star Wars franchise after the debacle of The Rise of Skywalker, started out strong for like 2 seasons, then somewhat petered out. Caught, it said, between the execs interfering with the story process and just the decisions of the writers. Then the following book of Boba Fett, too, also started out strong, but as a result of those same execs wanting to reintroduce Grogu from The Mandalorian, as well as the writer's decisions to again make the bounty hunter more likable instead of the badass bounty hunter that he was always made out to be, basically castrated the show. To the point that many are saying that Disney is trying to throw its actor, Tamora Morrison, under the bus and make us forget all about the show and the character. And then there's a slew of promised movies that were promoted well ahead of any production, only to be either delayed seemingly indefinitely or quietly shelved due to creative differences. Even the games in the franchise have met with mixed success, from the Battlefront games to the Jedi Survivor series and the recent Star Wars Outlaws. Some worked and others did not. What this chaos ultimately created was a frustration and cynicism over the franchise. Many fans outright deciding to quit, as well as many performers supposedly being very wary now of doing any Star Wars project because of said toxicity and creative issues. And many of these controversial projects have indeed revolved around the Jedi and the Force. But then again, why wouldn't they? They've been the core of the series since 1977. But now the fumbling and mixed results of the franchise in the last decade have tainted that popularity. It took the success of Andor to make this glaringly apparent. Tony Gilroy and the writer's approach to the series did not follow the formulaic method that most other stories did. The closest, I think, being season 1 of Mandalorian, writing a series that grew up with the fans rather than strictly addressing them as kids or just trying to appeal to their own kids. And as everyone knows, moreover, Tony Gilroy has outright stated that he is not a hardcore Star Wars fan, nor should that actually be required. Andor dialed up this anti-formulaic story writing, especially after the near sexual assault scene in season 3. It wasn't a case of shock value, but of superior writing without the interference from higher-ups, or not being too bound to the mythos. Hence, while it is still telling a story about the rebellion and not contradicting anything lore-wise, it's also not telling it from the traditional point of view, and thus freeing them of many of the constraints that lore and previous iterations have laid down. And because of that freedom, it can easily lead one to believe that supernatural and, quite frankly, quasi-religious elements of the Force and its adherents are no longer needed to enjoy a good story. Many people are just, quite frankly, tired of these tropes tripping up the storytelling and making Star Wars overall less enjoyable. So I definitely get it. However, is that while a Star Wars story doesn't need to be about the Force or the Jedi or the Sith, the fact still remains that their presence remains in that universe in some way, shape, or form, one way or another, and cannot be wholly forgotten or disregarded because it's no longer trendy. Now, by trendy, I mean that there's always been a growing suspicion of the quasi-religious storytelling of chosen ones and sacred orders being the only ones capable of saving the world. Now, in these news stories, the people who normally just get caught up in the middle of this now not only have agency independent of larger forces at work, but are also the driving forces within that universe itself. Or, in other words, it just, quite frankly, is very empowering. There's nothing wrong with that either. But there's also nothing wrong with those larger elements in there as well, especially since the core of the franchise was again built off those elements. Never mind the original trilogy, and that it was with the help of the Jedi that the Empire, led by a Sith, ultimately fell. Just look at where Andor ultimately leads to, Rogue One. Now, Rogue One is what kicked off these type of stories, I think, in the franchise, being about a group of nobodies, basically, and soldiers fighting to make a difference in the rebellion, Andor included. But it too also cannot escape, nor tries to, the overarching legends and influence of the Force. From a monk on Scarif, who quite frankly we're not quite sure if he used the Force or not, to the arrival of Darth Vader over Scarif to fuck up the Rebel fleet so badly that they won't go toe-to-toe with the Imperial fleet ever again until Return of the Jedi. And then, of course, there's just the fucking lightsaber massacre. Nothing screamed the importance of the presence of the Force in even non-Force oriented stories than Vader's hallway massacre of the Rebel soldiers, because it puts to the test the idea that you only need normal people to make a difference. The hallway massacre establishes that while ordinary people can make a difference, they also cannot overcome those enemies without the supernatural elements somehow coming into play or gaining supernatural allies themselves. Therefore, while it was ordinary people who started the rebellion, it does take the reintroduction of the Jedi, aka Luke Skywalker, to basically help them overcome finally the Empire. Because the Empire is being run by the Sith, who are oriented and using the Force, who, when times get tough, will use the Force to give them that advantage. Again, Vader's hallway massacre. So, all is to say that while Andor is still an excellent series and worthy of watching, it also does not remove the importance of the Jedi, the Force, or the Sith, because they are elements that are woven into that world, and that when they decide to introduce themselves into the framework, quite frankly, ordinary people are not going to stand up to that. This is the Fictional Mindbender. Have a good day.